Hello, welcome to Free Will Science of Religion. I'm Chandler Klebs, and I'm here with Mitch J, George Ortega, and David Joseph. And the topic today is going to be about happiness versus depression and suicide, and how, if we really had the type of free will that people are claiming, we would be able to make ourselves happy and no one would be attempting suicide. And so here's the deal. People, they behave differently when they're depressed than they do when they're happy. When they're depressed, they don't do the things that they like to do. They're whatever, whether it's music or sports or jogging or whatever it is, they're less interested when they're depressed. And so, but people are happier when they're doing the things they like to do, but for some reason they're stuck in this cycle of depression. And if people have a free will, as some people claim, why does this depression exist?
I think it's a great way to demonstrate to people that they don't have a free will. That basically, most people think that they what they choose to think is up to them, and not just what they choose to think, but also what they choose to feel. I think that most people would hold that conception of free will, and to the extent who freely wills to not just get depressed but to feel any negative feeling, because also like our feelings are dependent to a great extent on our thoughts. We have a certain thought, and if it's a depressing thought, then we'll get a depressing feeling. So absolutely, it's a good way to show people, in a very experiential way, that no, they don't have this free will that they believe they do.
Yeah. In our last episode, we mentioned the idea about how would you choose your thoughts? Because if there's a thought you want to not think, you first have to think the thought, to before you can not think it. So how in the world, if we know it's incoherent to control your thoughts, but since your thoughts affect your mood, how can you affect your mood?
When this conversation starts between the free will believer and the free will skeptic, the free will believer has to constantly make concessions, concession after concession. And what it usually boils down to is this notion of partial free will. It's always about demonstrating that not only do we not have free will, but that we don't have a partial free will either. That isn't a reasonable thing. We've talked about it many, many times on the show before, but I suppose we might get into it again today. Um, so, just to play devil's advocate, I think when it comes to the depression, the believer in free will would say, well, that person has less free will. That depressed person obviously isn't choosing, but there are certain periods, certain situations where some people, some of the time, in some situations, can choose. So, what we really need to do is make the argument, I think, again, for why there's no partial free will.
Well, one way to do that, Mitch, is to turn that question around to them. In other words, like, if that's what they believed, then they have to kind of like present a rationale for, like, for example, in which cases can we choose not to feel depressed, and in which cases can we not? And that's where I think that get muddled up, because like how, the key is kind of like to get them to understand that. So like finding, we can present cases where they don't have control clearly, and then the question becomes for them, well, what kind of example would differ from that? I mean, like what would be different about a case where they do have control? I mean, like, for example, if they said that, well, for example, like today I'm feeling great, so my free will is working today, whereas like yesterday I wasn't, so it wasn't working as well. And then, our comeback to that is like, well, was what happened today versus what happened yesterday really up to you? I mean, like, did you really choose to not be as depressed today? And also, it's a real problem for them.
Yeah, I mean, yes. So this really is the crux of the problem, right? I know you said this is a challenge for them, but the believer in free will, I don't think they necessarily recognize why that argument, that line of argumentation, is such a threat to their stance. Chandler, do you wanna chime in on this?
Yeah, because people do the partial free will thing and they say, oh, well, we don't have a choice about this, but we have a choice about something else. Like an example as well, we don't choose, we don't have a free will that enables us to lose weight or maintain our weight. So we can't control how much we eat, but we can still choose whether or not we eat an apple or an orange. And George and I, we talked about in our last episode about, what good is this thing? It doesn't let people choose to be happy. It doesn't let them choose to lose weight. And so what they do is they've narrowed down to a free will that's so tiny that it's of no effect to any issue. So even if we were to grant them and say, sure, you have the tiny free will over which cartoon you watch or whether eat which fruit you eat. It's like it has no practical applications in the realm of moral responsibility because they've reduced it to all amoral choices that have no impact on society. And so then we can bring back in the moral responsibility and realize that over the big life and death issues, homicide, suicide, and of course obesity, which kills as well, they don't have the free will to stop themselves from killing themselves or to stop themselves from killing other people. So then, if how whatever ethical system you've got, um, it falls apart and you can't make people morally responsible since they can't. We know that they can't be responsible for their thoughts, and we've explained that so clearly.
Yeah, and again, so like, I guess, what, and what we have to figure out is what they don't understand about that, because you explain that to them, and they'll still say, well, yeah, but it still feels kind of like it's up to me, and so it's kind of like this. It's not technically a feeling because it really is a conclusion, but they just have this sense that it's up to them, and that's the key. And in other words, like, we can present a lot of different, we have presented a lot of different logical refutations to free will, but it may be we haven't yet hit on the kind of explanation that people need to hear on just the exact wording, the exact conceptual presentation of this.
Well, it's probably going to be different for different people, isn't it? That some people might accept, say, what we're talking about here in this podcast, but others will probably dismiss it and they'll have some kind of emotional reason or, egotistical reason for doing that.
I agree with you, David, but I would hope that we can have, like, there are groups, like, for example, somebody at a recent meetup, she was like, advocating that we are morally responsible for what we do fundamentally. And then I posed this challenge to her. She happened to be a school teacher. I said to her, listen, your moral code, I'm sure, kind of like is against your yelling at your kids. I think that she teaches elementary school kids. And she agreed. She agreed with that, right? And then I asked her, well, listen, have you ever lost your temper with your kids and yelled at them and just spoken harshly to them? And at that point, once she acknowledged she had done that, she finally began to get it. So who knows? Maybe we haven't, like, stressed the moral responsibility aspect of this enough. Maybe we're working too much on the causality or this generic logic. But you're right. I think with certain, that while it might be different for each person in a certain sense, that I think there might be categories of people where we can reach, let's say 20, 30, 40% of the population in a certain way.
Right, yeah. So we need to kind of adopt a mass market, so to speak.
Well, here's an interesting thought, guys, because now it's clear that anyone who rejects free will automatically rejects moral responsibility because, moral responsibility requires to be the originator of your thoughts and feelings and actions. But here's the key. There are tons of people who believe in no moral responsibility, but they believe in free will. And I'm talking about this is very, very common. Like people who say, well, morality is just an opinion and it's all relative, it's subjective, and don't force your opinions on me. So if I want to murder and rape, it's my right to choose, that kind of stuff. And typically you'll find that these are former Christians who were told, well, morality comes from God and you're more responsible to God. And then they turn atheist, and then they feel, hey, morality is gone because there's no God, because they were taught that morality is based on God. That's one example. I'm sure there are other examples where people have said morality is an illusion, or they'll say moral responsibility is an illusion, yet they still believe they have free will. So how do we get people to understand that although we're saying that nobody's morally responsible, how do we get them to understand that we're also not a bunch of relativists who are saying that morality doesn't matter?
What strange case of Richard Dawkins? Richard Dawkins, the biologist, the atheist, the writer, the intellectual celebrity. Richard Dawkins, one of the four horsemen of the new atheist movement. We all know Dawkins, of course. Years ago, before the free will issue became such a hot button topic, at least in intellectual circles and on the internet, when it was more about atheism and more about politics, and Richard Dawkins wrote an article called, I think, Let's All Stop Beating Basil's Car. I can give you guys the link afterward. Any listeners who are listening to this podcast right now, just do a quick Google search for that. And you'll see that in that article, Dawkins, without mentioning the exact term free will, delivers a splendid refutation of the idea. Let me just provide a few sentences from the opening of the article. Ask people why they support the death penalty or prolonged incarceration for serious crimes, and the reasons they give will usually involve retribution. There may be past mention of deterrence or rehabilitation, but the surrounding rhetoric gives the game away. People want to kill a criminal as payback for the horrible things he did, or they want to give satisfaction to the victims of the crime or their relatives. An especially warped and disgusting application of the flawed concept of retribution is Christian crucifixion as atonement for sin. Dawkins, end quote. So Dawkins goes on to say that retribution as a moral principle is incompatible with a scientific view of human behavior. People are like computers, they're governed by physics. When a computer malfunctions, we don't punish it. We track down the problem and fix it. So it seems like clearly, right? I'm sure to all of us here, it sounds like Richard Dawkins at that moment in time was a strident, hard incompatibilist, a strident skeptic of free will. But he didn't use the term free will. And it turns out when he was probed about that term years after this article, he had said it some that
Mitch, you're cutting in and out again. Guys, mute your mics.
Sorry, can you guys hear me? I was saying that Dawkins actually invoked free will later on. After this, he said on more than one occasion that, yeah, I guess we have free will. I don't know. I think free will is compatible with this. Until a time after that, his fellow horseman, fellow new atheist, Sam Harris, changed his mind again. So it's really the terminology that is scaring people.
All right, Mitch, you're cutting in really like. Do you have like an iPhone or something? I mean, for future podcasts, because again, sometimes the cell phones, like whether it's an Android or an iPhone, sometimes their technology is better.
I have several devices. Did a lot of that get cut off? I don't.
Yeah, most of it. No, toward the end, the last, let's say 30, 40 seconds, it was more out than in.
All right. Long story short, Dawkins went from indirectly saying we don't have free will to saying we do have free will to finally saying, oh yeah, I guess we don't have free will again. all because the terms are so confusing and because people are so scared about the impact it has on moral responsibility.
Okay, in line with that, for example, there's a very common expression in the English language. Don't judge a man unless you've walked a mile in his shoes, right? So let's say you were to ask 50 undergraduates, what's the meaning of this phrase, of this adage? I bet they would say something that, well, you really can't know what the person has gone through, what the person's experiences are. So it's really wrong or unfair to hold this person responsible for, who they became or how they, became. So yeah, maybe we need to do that. Maybe we need to invoke these kinds of like, on the one hand, when you use the term free will, people have such a powerful resistance against it. On the other hand, if you frame it in different ways, like Dawkins did, and how some of our popular expressions express it, people can more easily get it that way.
Yeah, it feels like one approach is to just not say free will, then convince someone you don't have, like you said, that a person was forced to do what he did, that we should feel sorry for him, empathetic for him, and then only after that, then finally reveal the trick, and say, hey, this means we don't have free will. Think about it. It
That's how
seems
I.
like, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say that's how I came to the conclusion that we don't have free will. At first I was introduced to the idea that we're all influenced by our environments and
Mhm.
genetic predispositions, and then it wasn't until much later that I was shown Sam Harris talking about no free will.
Right,
Absolutely.
exactly. Right. Yeah.
There's another expression, like, somebody sees somebody kind of like yelling at a kid or something, right? And somebody comes to the kid's defense, saying to the person who's yelling, listen, the kid's doing the best they can. The kid was doing the best they. People get this. People get this. Like, so, and so, all right, Mitch, like relative to this idea of like creating a not-for-profit, of like just organizing our efforts more, once we have this in place, I think what we could do is like, for example, on my blog, on your Twitter, on your website, on Trick's website,
Freewillisfalse.com.
right? Well, yeah. So like, what we should do is like, it. We should launch campaigns so that we're all treating the same theme at the same time. So like, you look on the internet, you search for free will, and all of a sudden you have 5 to 10 different articles within the same day or week about the same theme. I think that's one way to kind of like amplify our because like when people get the impression that, oh my God, everybody's talking about this, all of a sudden the importance of it is amplified.
Yep, certainly.
I was just going to ask, what is our kind of target audience supposed to be? Is it people who already have an idea of what free will is, and we're trying to convince them that it doesn't exist? Or are we trying to get the average Joe who hasn't really considered it to kind of understand the topic and convince them that free will is an illusion?
It's a good question, David, because like I think sometimes, like a lot of people, when you ask them if they have a free will, if people have free will, they are actually not understanding the question. They think it's about political freedom or something like that. And so then the question that we are faced with is like, it's an important question, David. I mean, it's like, are they more amenable to rejecting free will than people who already have a very, a proper, a more proper understanding of the concept? That's a good question.
I think that our target audience should be primarily to people who accept the theory of evolution. And the reason for that is because once somebody, like for example, Richard Dawkins and Jerry Coyne, they're already well versed in biology and know far more about evolution than I ever will understand. And so people learn a lot about that from them. So somebody could use that example as, do life forms freely choose how they evolve and how they change species over all this time?
Yeah, I think without really saying it directly, we've segued into the secondary topic that we wanted. We've changed our focus here at this point in the podcast to empathy. Recently in discussions on the internet with both skeptics alike, we've been talking about how empathy is directly linked to the rejection of free will. So um, people who believe in free will, when they're being empathetic, are really making a declaration that there is no free will. And when their empathy runs out, they're now saying, since I don't want to be as empathetic as I was before, now I'm saying you have free will. Chandler and I brought this up, and Jamie, on the last podcast. We gave a political background for this. Maybe David, you and George would like to put your own opinions on. So I presented the example of how most people, especially people on the left side of the political spectrum, will say that poor people don't choose to be poor. They think about the factors that makes poor people poor. Not for a moment do they even entertain the idea that it's their fault. Yet when it comes to something like a character trait, like being industrious, being a hardworking person, all of a sudden they blame a person for being lazy. Now,
Right.
how does that make any sense?
Well, it doesn't make any sense, but it's like I think I've said this before. It's like a truncated form of causality that they kind of conjure into existence. And I think that stems from the fact that we're kind of in an environment of scarcity, and people have to kind of say that they deserve something that they've managed to get hold of, and they have to find reasons to keep it. And if there's scarcity, then there's not enough to go around. Everybody's kind of defending their own little patch, and they have to say, I deserve this because I've done this, and so this is my patch, and I'm going to keep it, and I deserve it. And I think that just spreads out from there until you get people who just kind of believe in free will as standard, but don't really give it too much thought.
Yeah,
If if that makes sense at all.
I think it makes sense. What do you think about that, George?
All right, you're just, framing it from when you started that, like, you said, I think that, like, empathy kind of like necessarily suggests or implies that people are rejecting free will.
Empathy is the rejection of free will.
No, no, but
That's
let me,
exactly a belief in free will.
right, but let
That's my
me,
argument.
no, I know. Let me propose an example. For example, you have two people who have done something wrong. One person apologizes, admits that they've done wrong, and they apologize. The other person doesn't. Now, I can see a person being empathetic toward the person who has apologized, and not toward the other, without this person actually, um, rejecting free will. In other words, like, this person may conclude that the person of his free will did something wrong, and because now of his free will he's apologized, then he's deserving of the empathy. So I'm not, I'm not sure.
But I think but hold on a second. In that scenario, the free will believer is saying that the person who apologized used his used this free will to make himself you see what I'm saying? It's like so uh so the point is this though. When someone is empathy, so empathy is about imagining yourself in someone else's shoes, like you said earlier, George. So um so when someone feels sorry for someone, what they do is they imagine themselves that person's position and go, if I were in your shoes, I would be in a similar situation or even stronger, the same situation. And that's why I can't blame you, because I recognize what happened to you. This is exactly what empathy is. It is identical. It is identical to this notion that we can't control what we do. And when we're not empathetic, it's because we think someone can control it, right? The free will believer says you could have done something else, which
Well,
is ridiculous, but that is the point, right?
Mitch, I think one point that I've brought up in the past is, like, for example, within Christianity, the concept surrounding Jesus is that he has, provided a way for us to be forgiven of our sins. We're sinful, and like, this is a forgiveness. We can forgive ourselves. But the thing is that in this context, this forgiveness, which is kind of like a form of empathy, is falls under the model of morality. In other words, it's the right and godly and good thing to do to forgive someone. Now, we might want to contrast that with, a stronger refutation of free will that says, like, we forgive ourselves and each other not simply because it's the right thing to do, which may not, actually refute free will, but because it no longer makes sense to indict us in the first place. So I think, I don't know. To me, it seems like empathy can be evoked just from a sense of goodness rather than a sense of hard
But
logic.
I don't know. I think you're missing the point, though, because the definition of the word empathy, what empathy means, is to be compassionate towards someone because you imagine yourself in their shoes. That's what empathy is. That's
Right,
exactly what it
but
is.
let's say I believe in free will, right? So like I believe that I've done something. All right, I think I'm beginning to see your point. So like I
Right?
believe I have.
And you're empathetic. If you believe in free will, at those moments when you are being empathetic, what you're really doing is discarding your belief in free will. So to this partial free will thing again, this arbitrary partial free will, saying now at this time, obviously you had no control over what you did, blah blah blah.
Well, I mean, again, like for example, like within our legal system, which holds to the belief in free will, um, after a person has been punished for a certain amount of time or something, then like the probation or some kind of like a lessening of the sentence is it's kind of like it doesn't suggest that the person didn't do what they did unfreely. It's simply it's it's based because like a lot of people believe that yes, we are flawed, we make mistakes, we all make mistakes, and that's why we have to forgive each other. But I think the belief is that we make those mistakes of our free will, and it's contradictory because like on the one hand, if we have this nature, if we can't but make mistakes, that would seem to suggest that we don't have a free will. But all right, I just looked up the word empathy, the feeling that you understand and share another person's experiences and emotions, the ability to share someone's um, feeling. So again, I'm not, I can't yet see how empathy has to kind of like,
How
complete.
can
Go ahead.
why we judge people? The reason why we judge people, why our empathy runs out, is because of this idea of control. When we think someone chooses to do something, we are not empathetic. So if that's how that has to be how it works. Like if you really break it down and think about it, what are we saying when we're not being empathetic? When people don't feel sorry for Hitler, it's because they go, well, no, Hitler got what he deserved. This is the idea. It's like he made several bad decisions. I wouldn't have made those decisions, so I don't feel sorry for him. If we felt the circumstances were different, like if there was some really exculpatory, uh, I don't know, evidence there, something like a large tumor in his brain or really, really abusive parenting, all of a sudden it causes the human mind to think more about the reasons, the impact, the things that made him become who he became. So when we're being empathetic, we think about the reasons. We think about if I were in your situation, what would cause me to be that way? When we're not being empathetic, we're not doing that anymore. What we're saying is, you made choices. That's the difference. When our empathy runs out, We are not empathetic towards people when we think about the fact that they made choices and they could have made different choices. Then we're not empathetic. We are empathetic when we say, wow, they had no choice. So it's this direct link. And again, as I'm trying to argue, this is another incarnation of the this idea of partial free will. This is the thing to attack, and we've attacked it before. Earlier podcast episodes, people can look up where we dissected all that's wrong with partial will and showed why partial free will is full free will. So if you refute free will, you also refute partial free will. I don't want to get into the details right now, but do you kind of see where I'm going with that, George?
Um, I can see that as an example in some cases, but again, I can kind of like conceptualize a case. For example, somebody believes that another person has done something wrong of their free will, and their first tendency is to want to punish that person. And
Okay,
let's
I want to punish that person. Why?
Right, and let's say that person is being punished, because of that, by society, by whomever. And then like it dawns on the person who believes in free will that, well, like this person, for whatever reason, is not going to be able to do that same wrong thing again. Maybe because the opportunity is no longer there for whatever reason. So maybe based on that rationale, the person says, well, not because the person doesn't have a free will, but because that person is not likely or won't do the same thing again, that all of a sudden there doesn't seem to be any deterrent value in further punishment. So again, like, while I see your point that in some cases the empathy would definitely be a reflection of the understanding that the person doesn't have a free will, I'm not sure I can extend that to all examples.
I think there's some miscommunication here with what I'm arguing and what you're saying. So, for example, if I took the example you just made step by step and put and put it in the context of the argument that I'm trying to make, here's how I would say that. So, a person did something bad, and now the one who changed his opinion, right? Who at first wanted this person to be punished. At first, how did this person feel? Well, that person thought, well, yeah, that person chose to do something bad. I don't feel sorry for him. If he didn't feel that way, if he didn't feel that that person chose to do something bad, if he felt that that person did what he did because of the things that made him become who, that person would say, wow, that would have been me too. If I had his brain, I would be him. But so I'm not. I'm saying this is what we're saying, right? This is exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah,
Did I clear that up? I don't know if there's still some confusion.
yeah,
We can move on.
yeah.
We can get back to this later, perhaps off air.
Yeah,
I'll explain
here's the
that.
deal. I just wanted to say about that is I agree with Mitch here because what it comes down to is any time that you're empathizing with someone, basically it involves two things. First of all, you see that this person is in pain. They're suffering. Now, if you believe that they chose to suffer in that way by
Exactly.
bringing it on themselves, if you believe somebody brought that suffering on themselves, you have no empathy on them. Whereas if you see them as a victim, because you realize that they could not have avoided that suffering, well, then you have a greater empathy. And here's what it comes down to. Like a fine example is people blame women for being raped. I'm sure you've heard of this before, where some woman is raped and then they say, well, that she chose to dress in a way that provoked the rapist to he had no choice but to rape her. There are people who say these things, you know what I'm saying? And so what they've done there is they're saying that women have free will and men don't. That's what they're basically saying. But then when it comes to non-human animals like factory farm suffering, people tend to be more empathetic to these animals, realizing these animals didn't choose to be in that situation, because how could they? Most people get that, but then when it comes to human beings, they tend to attribute free will to them. So it really comes down to, you only have empathy with someone if you understand they didn't choose to be in that situation that's causing them pain.
Exactly. And in those moments when we are empathetic, those are the moments where the free will belief goes out the window. Or where I guess the person who argues for a partial free will belief would say, okay, well, he couldn't use his free will to overcome this. Those are the moments. So when we extend this notion, it becomes very easy to argue why, when we reject free will, society as a whole becomes much more empathetic. Only the free will skeptic really has the capacity. Well, I shouldn't say only, but certainly the free will skeptic has the capacity for maximum empathy. When you say no one controls anything, then your empathy is the greatest that it can be. That's when you're just focused on solutions, humane, moral, effective solutions, trying to be as compassionate as possible when devising strategies. I'm saying this is what we're saying. I'm saying this is
Yeah.
one of those connections that people. I don't know. Does that make it a little clearer,
Well,
George? I
yeah,
don't
I
know.
mean, like, to the extent, exactly, to the extent that our world overcomes this notion of free will, all of a sudden it absolutely makes no sense to blame people, and it makes complete sense to be completely empathetic. So yeah, so like this free will belief is a powerful agent against empathy. I mean, absolutely. The more we overcome it, it's like the stronger the rationale is for a person to be compassionate, to be empathetic.
Yeah, and guys, I'm an example of this because basically the reason my empathy is so high is partly because I don't believe in free will. Because back when I believed in free will, I had the speciesist problem of where I was blaming humans for their choices, but not non-human animals. And so what's happened is now it's just extended to more people. To all of humanity now, the empathy I already had.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
I still get
Or think
angry.
about it. Take that, David. Go ahead.
I was just going to say I still get angry at people.
Well, that's because that's the next step, and I think we all do. In other words, like I can't claim to, like, 24/7 be able to like act on my disbelief in free will. Sometimes somebody will do something, and emotionally, I think because we've been so conditioned by our society, by our world, to hold people responsible and to hold ourselves responsible, we really have to fight against this, and it's not going to happen automatically, but that's why we can overcome it step by step.
Yeah, we'll want to do an episode about that. But let's see, guys. Now we've been going for about 43 minutes. Do you think we talked about everything enough in this episode?
Uh, there is just one extra thing I wanted to jump in with. I was going to say that just finishing this line of thought. Think about it. The average person, at some point, at some point, runs out of empathy, don't they? You feel sorry for a child. The average person will say, "Okay, it's just a kid," as George, you know, alluded to earlier, the example he gave earlier. Feel sorry for an old person or a person with Alzheimer's, someone with dementia. Okay, feel sorry for that person. Feel sorry for a baby. Feel sorry for this person and that person and that person. But at a certain point, we split the world into heroes and villains. How many people honestly feel sorry for Hitler? Who
I do.
feels sorry for Hitler? What kind of person would feel sorry for Hitler and why?
Someone who understands he had no choice but to be what he
Exactly.
is.
Exactly. Because all the excuses run out. Oh, he's not, well, he wasn't old, he wasn't crippled, he wasn't this, he wasn't that, he wasn't. He wasn't that. So why am I feeling sorry for him? Because he became the person he became because of the experiences he had, because of the brain he had. He was unfortunate to have the brain of Adolf Hitler and the experiences of Adolf Hitler and live in a time period of mass anti-Semitism and devastation in Austria and Germany as fallout after the First World War. And if you, as Sam Harris has said many times before, if you exchange places with him, Adam for Adam, you would be him. And that's where that comes from.
Yeah, I agree completely. I mean, absolutely. It's and that's again, so like we're moving from right now in our world, we will be compassionate and empathic and forgiving, for the most part for most people because they believe it's the right or good thing to do. And so now, as people understand that not only is it right, it's logical, it's completely insane to not be that way. It provides such a stronger motivation to be compassionate and empathetic.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and that's exactly why we're doing this, why we're sending this message to people, because the more free will skeptics, the less crime, less retribution, more empathy, it's better for all.
And we're not just making this up. There's a lot of articles that support this. There's a lot of research that's been done, and more. There's more research that's been done that shows that people who are given information that affects how much they believe in free will. So they're given, so some test subjects are given information that makes their belief in free will weaken. They tend to be much more compassionate. Like they give they all of a sudden they're in favor of shorter prison sentences, for example. If you go to freewillisfalse.com and you go to the podcast forums for the Free Will Science and Religion podcast, you'll see all kinds of media, articles, books, blogs, with all kinds of information about that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, now Mitch just reminded me, since he was explaining his Free Will is False site, that maybe at the end of each episode we should explain where people can find more of our work. So,
absolutely.
yeah, so George, just tell our audience a little bit about your site and your show exploring the illusion of free will.
Okay, yeah, if you just keyword exploring the illusion of free will or go to causalconsciousness.com, one word, then, we have a collection there of like um, these podcasts are listed there, a lot of articles going back, several decades that are refuting free will. Um, a lot of articles in the news. It's a resource for a lot of information. It just provides a lot of different ways of understanding not just why we don't have a free will, but why this matters. Why our world would benefit in so many ways by our overcoming the illusion.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and David, do you have a website or anything that you do like that?
Not really, to be honest, but I'd recommend anyone go to the zeitgeistmovement.com and check out their documentaries because they're pretty much heavily influenced on describing the environmental conditions and stuff like that, why people do what they do.
Yeah, okay. And then people can find out the most about me either through chandlerklebs.wordpress.com or the YouTube channel, which I post the videos of these episodes where I take Trick's logo and the audio of an episode. So I'm easy to find too. So I think that covers everything.
All
So,
right.
all right. Well, you've been listening to Free Will, Science, and Religion with Chandler Klebs, Mitch J, George Ortega, and David Joseph, and we've talked about many things about empathy, about depression, suicide. I hope you've enjoyed. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.